While traveling along the Big Creek River in what is now Washington State, close to the Big Creek Falls area, a group of fur trappers discovered an abandoned camp in May 1815. It was clear to them that the camp had belonged to another group of trappers, but it looked as though it had been abandoned for a while. They searched the camp and discovered a journal concealed beneath a rock beneath a beaver pelt. The man who found it kept it and passed it down through his family. In it, they recorded the unsettling incidents that occurred to the group in May and I think the date is June 2nd, but I'm not positive. What has happened to us over the past few weeks and what is happening now is something none of us could have ever understood. We're all scared and confused, and we don't know what to do anymore. We're all exhausted. There were 9 of us. The journal belonged to a man named John Patrick Henry of the Pacific Fur Company, and it has been transcribed to modern English. Down to 7, I worry that we will continue to decline. When we started this journey, I knew 3 of the men well, having previously set traps with them, but the others were strangers. We arrived at our current location a few weeks ago, and 4 days later, we had trapped the area out, so we made the decision to relocate. The next day, downstream, the morning it began, was much like the others before we got up, made breakfast, drank coffee, and packed our travel supplies. The walk was slow going as we went downstream and then left. It was mid-afternoon when we came to a group of thick pine trees that resembled walls stretching out as far as we could see. I was in the back, but I could hear one of the men angrily blurt out as I went through the trees and into the clearing. What in the bloody hell is going on? I was exhausted and breathing heavily, so it took me a moment to fully understand. We had no plan as to how far we'd go along the river, as we had more weight now from the fresh beaver pelts. The reason behind his anger, the remains of a freshly constructed fire were lying on the ground in front of us. I began to look around, and everything looked familiar, but then I realized that we were back at the camp we had left this morning. I thought, this is a damn camp we left this morning. To which Ephraim, our group leader, said, "Hogwash, it's not possible. Samuel, look more closely. You see the engraving on the tree there. Carson said yesterday, Ephraim," and my ear began to ring as the men started. We started to debate the events that led us back to our former camp, even though we were clearly going downstream along the river. It was completely baffling. I reflected on this as I set down our gear and hides, feeling the weight of exhaustion. Moving away from the group, I leaned against a tree and observed their ongoing disputes about the situation. While I sat there, I contemplated the possibilities, considering that perhaps we had just circled back or had somehow gotten turned around and retraced our steps. Whatever it was that had come upon us, we truly had no option but to spend another night there and leave again in the morning. When the morning arrived, just like before, we ate, collected our belongings, and then departed. However, this time Ephraim took the lead while the rest of us followed. As we walked, I recalled specific landmarks on my right from the day before, which indicated to me that we hadn't gotten lost. No one mentioned it, seemingly not wanting to engage in an argument, but I suspected some of them were aware of it too. This time, I was more attentive to my surroundings when a wall of dense pine trees appeared before me, and I nearly called out that we should go around them, but everyone seemed worn out, so I held my tongue. I found myself trailing behind once more, as I tend to be the slowest, and this time lagged even further back. Before I could reach the trees, I heard Ephraim shouting something, though I couldn't quite make out his words, so I quickened my pace. As I entered the clearing, I was shocked to see that we had ended up right back at the camp. Ephraim tossed down his musket and began to move around. Frantic, he gathered some dead branches, snapping them against the trees while he shouted profanities. The rest of us stood there, speechless and astonished, thinking this was beyond belief. What kind of witchcraft could this be? I muttered softly to myself. The devil is involved, Duncan said. You can't be sure of that, but something is definitely wrong, Carson replied. What else could it be? Duncan pressed. It's not the devil, for heaven's sake, we're under a curse, Ephraim shouted in frustration. It took some convincing to help Ephraim calm down before we could figure out our next steps. After a lengthy and intense discussion, we decided to head back upstream the next day and seek out a different tributary to set traps. Most people in the camp were silent that night. I remember gazing into the fire and wrestling with troubling thoughts about the situation at hand. The next morning, I was suddenly awakened by the shout, "Hey, Carson and Duncan are missing," from Alton. "What in the world are you talking about?" yelled Ephraim as he sat up and rubbed his eyes. "They're gone, but their gear is still here," Alton replied. I jumped up to check it out. I could see Duncan's moccasins and Carson's boots beside their bedrolls. No one could traverse these mountains without their footwear, I stated aloud. I was filled with panic, though I tried to conceal it from the other men. Something was definitely amiss, and I felt an urgent need to vacate the area. "Get up, men, we're leaving now," yelled Ephraim as he stood up, looking down at their bedrolls. "I don't know what happened to Duncan and Carson, but we're not staying here. I suspect they left on their own." In agreement, we quickly packed our belongings and departed without having breakfast, eager to distance ourselves from that camp. As we walked upstream, we chatted and joked, trying to lighten the mood. I began to feel a sense of relief, but thoughts of Carson and Duncan lingered in my mind. No one, absolutely no one, would traverse the mountains without their equipment, especially their boots. Perhaps they had lost their sanity. I reassured myself as it was mid-afternoon when we rounded a small hill, and what I beheld left me in shock. I almost dropped my musket. In front of us stood a wall of pine trees. "Bloody hell," I muttered. Ephraim grumbled something about how we should go around. Just as I was about to suggest an alternate route, he stated we would try circling the damn thing this time. Despite his remark, I still sensed that something was off. We had been heading in the wrong direction, yet we still faced the wall of pines. We turned and began traveling west, moving for quite some time, but the wall of trees remained. Eventually, we reached the base of a hill and paused. To pause for a break before tackling the climb, but no one spoke as we rested. I suspected everyone was lost in thought, pondering if this nightmare would ever conclude. When we finally reached the summit, my heart dropped, and a wave of dread surged within me as we gazed down into the small valley. The horror felt endless. The line of pines stood before us, seemingly stretching on indefinitely in every direction. To cope with the situation, my mind wandered elsewhere while the men resumed their arguments once again. It could have been the devil himself or perhaps some form of witchcraft. In the end, it didn't matter. Whatever it was undeniably real, and we found ourselves trapped in a never-ending nightmare. We were far from the river and in need of water, so we chose to return to the point where we had veered west and passed through the wall of pines. By the time we reached it, darkness was nearly upon us. Before stepping through, we exchanged glances, and I noticed Ephraim looking scared, which was unusual for him since he rarely displayed emotions other than anger. I assumed he was blaming himself for being in this situation. "Let's get this over with," he said, leading the way as we followed him like before. After we navigated through the trees, we arrived back at camp. A thought crossed my mind as I moved into the clearing. What if I turned back? So I pivoted and retraced my steps, but ended up in the same spot I had just left. By that point, everyone was feeling both mentally and physically drained. We dropped our equipment, built a fire, had dinner, and then went to sleep. The next day, instead of trying to leave the area, we focused our efforts on locating deer and elk to eat. We were running low on meat and had extensive discussions about our next steps, but no one seemed to reach an agreement on how to escape or what actions to take. We made the choice to settle in and concentrate solely on survival. I believe it's June 7th. I haven't really been keeping track of time lately and haven't written in this journal for a few days. Yesterday, something unimaginable occurred. Ephraim and 3 other men decided to venture out in search of a way to escape, leaving the rest of us behind. It was midday, and I was alone by the campfire while Alton and Olan. We were out gathering wood not far from camp when I noticed something moving towards me from the trees. I quickly stood up, grabbed my musket, and aimed it. "Ephraim, is that you?" I asked as I lowered my weapon. I could hardly recognize his face, which was disfigured and covered in blood. That's when I saw that both of his hands were missing and his pants were soaked in blood. He approached the fire and collapsed beside it. I hurried over, knelt down, and rolled him onto his back, asking what had happened. He was attempting to speak but struggled to breathe, blood oozing from his mouth as he drew his final breath. I shouted for Alan and Alton to hurry. A few minutes later they rushed back. "This can't be happening," Alton said, his voice shaking. "It is happening, I'm afraid," Olan replied. "We need to find the others," I said, my voice quivering with fear. "Okay, but we need to stick together," Olan responded. We grabbed our muskets and set off, hoping Ephraim had returned to camp. We set up a skirmish line, our weapons drawn, cautiously making our way through the forest without any clue about what lay ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were somehow connected to whatever was about to happen. After a while of walking alongside the river, I noticed a piece of clothing lying on the ground amongst the bushes. I whistled and pointed to alert the others that I spotted something ahead. As we approached, I realized it was Samuel's blue shirt. noticeably torn, but oddly, there was no blood on it. "Hey, take a look at that. What do you think it is?" "Look at that tree," Alton exclaimed, gesturing towards it. Carved into the trunk was something I had never seen before. A circle surrounded by letters that read B and L, along with some unfamiliar symbols inside. "Whatever that is out there, I really hope it doesn't come after us," Alan said, sounding anxious. Then Alton suddenly shouted, "Hey, look over there," and took off running. We quickly chased after him, but he halted just a short distance away, staring intently at something on the ground beside him. Beneath a large tree lay the gruesome, lifeless body of Emil, one of the 4 men who had ventured out in search of a way to escape. His injuries were as horrific as those of the others we had seen, and the same letters and symbols marked the tree. The only distinction was that the letters A and L were scrawled in blood on his chest. Alan made the sign of the cross and started praying. "There's something wicked going on here," he said after finishing. "We need to bury them," I responded softly, feeling indifferent and resigned to my fate of dying as well. "Let's head back to camp. We'll bury him tomorrow. Today we lay Ephraim to rest," Alton said, turning to walk back to camp. Once we arrived, we buried Ephraim near the river where the soil was soft and easy to excavate. The next day, we buried Emil beside him. In the days that followed, the letters A and L on Emil's chest plagued my thoughts. What did they signify? Had the killer written them, or had Emil inscribed them before his hands were severed? Everything was becoming so surreal. I was asleep when I suddenly woke up to find Alton hovering over me, looking down with an unsettling smile. I asked him what was wrong, but he just smiled ominously and went back to his spot. Today, while I was by the fire preparing lunch and Alan and Alton were out hunting, it struck me. I finally understand what the initials AL represent. I realize that my time on this earth is nearing its end. Despite our numerous attempts to break through the wall of pines, we've had no success. I'm going to conceal this journal and hope that someone discovers it so our deaths won't be in vain. It should not be overlooked that A represents Alton. I have strong suspicions that he is a type of demon. This was the last entry in John's journal, which also contained a rough sketch of the symbol they discovered on the trees. In addition to the journal, the men uncovered the graves of Ephraim and Ale, along with the 2 trees marked with the strange symbols and letters. For more terrifying horror stories, please subscribe.